Amanda Hastings. Thanks so much for making some time to join me on the podcast today. A very successful Drexel alum, one of the 40 under 40 Dragons from a few years ago. So thanks so much for making the time for us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. Thanks so much for having me today.
Well, you came highly recommended for this podcast, and it's a pleasure to finally get the chance to sit down and talk to you. So before we get into your professional career, which is very interesting, I want to go back to where it all started with the Dragons. So talk to me a little bit about why you chose the Drexel program, both athletically and academically.
Oh, wow. That's a really great question. At the time when I was applying, I wanted a competitive academic institution for college. And I knew that Drexel was going to be able to provide that. So that definitely put it on, I think, one of my top priorities to try to apply to and then hopefully get into and hopefully be able to play softball. Those are my goals. And at that time, I really wanted to study nutrition, and not many programs that had softball at a Division I level and nutrition were available, but Drexel was, and I was really hoping I would get recruited and be offered a scholarship, and I was lucky enough to have both of those. And at the time, I was considering potentially studying psychology, but I wasn't quite sure, and I started off as a nutrition major, and Drexel had both, and nutrition and psychology, luckily, because after I think the first semester at Drexel, the nutrition was probably not going to be for me, and the science was pretty tough, and I was not a science biology person, so I switched to psychology by the end of my freshman year, which is a great decision, going to Drexel and switching my major, because I did end up being a psychologist, so I made the right call, and I was lucky enough to get a scholarship and be able to play and get a lot of playing time, which was something that I was hoping for, but was obviously never guaranteed when you go into college sports.
Well, and you mentioned that switch from nutrition to psychology in that first year. So what was it about psychology that really interested you when you first showed up at Drexel?
That's a really great question. I had a professor, Dr. Barakat. She was at the time, she was teaching, I believe, at Penn and at Drexel, and she's taught developmental psychology, and I had taken that just as an elective as a nutrition major, and for the first time I felt like in college I was like, wow, I think this is something I'm understanding really well and like loving, and can I make a career out of this? And I took her advanced class that is next quarter, and I loved that as well. And I thought that was enough for me to make the final switch. But she taught that class incredibly well. I remember we had to write a paper on whether or not fathers were required for raising a child, and I was like, this is the first paper I really had to like think about, because I had a great relationship with my dad, but then we had to have research to support why these were so needed, or not needed in other people's opinions, and that really, I think I liked the creativity of that aspect of the learning, but then also how much passion that I had in really investigating child development that really ended up being the start of a career for me.
And how are you balancing your schoolwork and your interest in psychology at the time with your Division I athletics? You ended up having a very decorated career, first team CAA selection. So how did you find that balance while you were a student athlete at Drexel?
Sure. I mean, I think at the time felt like more of a survival. I've never been a person that is great at not procrastinating. And I did a lot of that during college. You still can end up graduating and being a procrastinator. It is possible, but I was definitely a procrastinator, but I did try to work very hard, and sometimes was more vulnerable to, I think, trying to overachieve, which I tried really hard to get better at as I've become a professional. But I think trying to balance it, especially during the season, was quite hard. In the spring season in particular. And I try to give myself some grace, knowing that I might not do as well missing class for games, but it actually ended up being that often in those seasons, I would do better. My time was better managed, and I wasn't able to procrastinate as much as I was potentially in the fall. So I actually ended up doing better in the spring semesters than expected. And I think the only struggle I had was that before my senior year, I, at that point in time, knew I was going to be applying to grad school. This was 2008 when there was a financial crisis. Not a lot of people were able to get jobs. And I knew I was going to need to go to grad school and hopefully get into a doctorate program. And I felt myself kind of, my motivation for continuing the senior year, I actually was coming off an injury, was lower than the other 3 years. And I had a really great coach that, I remember her saying, like, I can see you're not as motivated. Like, who do you play for? Is it you? Is it your dad? Is it the team? Like, who are you going to play for this year? And I ended up saying at the time, like, yeah, my dad has really helped me throughout the years craft me into a really great athlete and a really great competitor. And it may be that it was less for me this year, but like really being able to show him how much he had put time into that. I'll get a little choked up. But luckily, she was really responsive to that response and understanding. And then I think as that year continued, this was September, when I healed from my injury, and I realized even though I may want to be a psychologist later, I still had this really awesome senior year that I could enjoy and play for him, but also for me, and still had some things to accomplish. But I definitely remember that conversation with her, and I'm not sure if she does, but it was instrumental.
Wow, that's really powerful. I appreciate you sharing that. And I kind of want to, on that note, having to balance so much, especially at Drexel with the quarter system and how everything, and softball too. I mean, softball with a grueling schedule come springtime. And you mentioned, ironically, that actually made you manage your time better. How would you say that experience prepared you for your professional career now in the years that have gone on since then, having had to make that balance in college and then facing the real world afterwards?
Yeah. That's a really great question. I think still to this day, I have colleagues that I think do a better job of that than I do. I think I've learned in college, especially, like having to be able to say no to people. Like, no, I can't go to that party, or I can't do 3/4 of the group project. I really can do like my fourth, and that's it, because I had excuses, right? I had like legit excuses. But that allowed me, I think, to be able to be a little bit more assertive throughout my career of what I can put onto my plate and be able to manage comfortably. And I tend to be someone that is vulnerable doing too much. And I think if I hadn't been an athlete in a rigorous academic institution, I think nowadays I'd be more vulnerable to not setting better limits. And I think Drexel definitely allowed me to develop some of those skills and be more assertive now as a professional.
Yeah, I could definitely relate to that in my experience at Drexel. I wanted to do everything all at once, and then it got to a point where it was overwhelming. But it's good to find those limits, I think, in your college years, and then know what those boundaries are once you get out in the real world.
Yeah,
So,
and finding that balance between fun and work,
and that's a hard balance, but it's necessary. And then, you mentioned you after you graduate from Drexel, obviously you need to spend time as a graduate student to become a clinical psychologist. So what was that process like? What was the application process for grad school like? And then once you got in, what was the studies that you had to have to become certified?
Yeah. So I remember I got an interview, I think it was like January. And so I remember like going to practice that morning for softball. The games hadn't started yet. And then I drove all the way to DC, interviewed, stayed in a hotel, drove all the way back the next day, and then like went to practice that, or weightlifting like that next afternoon. So it was like a whirlwind, but that was something I really wanted. I really wanted to continue my education. I wanted to try a new city. I fell in love with Philadelphia from Drexel's years, but I was ready for a different city, I thought, and learning to balance that, but also having my coach's support. She really wanted me to be able to be a professional after graduation, and that was something that I really appreciated. So luckily I got in an early admission and committed to going rather early, so I knew I was going to grad school before that next season started, which I think was a luxury. I think a lot of people didn't know if they were going to have a job that next year, didn't know if they were getting into grad school, didn't really have a plan. But I think the Drexel co-op gave me such a leg ahead before I had even graduated, and thinking about a plan and what I wanted to do. And so graduate school was definitely hard, but it did not compare to, I think, the time constraints of being an athlete while, during undergrad. I don't think I've ever been as busy as I was in those 4 years.
Wow. Well, hey, that's definitely what we want to hear, is that prepared you for that. Obviously it's stressful to go through, but definitely helped you out in the long run. And just for clarification, what was your graduate school experience? How many years did you have to study to become certified, and what schools did you go to?
Yeah, sure. So I went to school technically for 5 years for my doctorate in psychology. So I got my master's first at the American School of Psychology, then got my doctorate right after. So it was a 5-year plan, and I luckily got accepted right into that from undergrad. And then I did an additional 2 years at Johns Hopkins, getting a certificate in ABA, which is Applied Behavior Analysis, which is a evidence-based intervention for children with autism in particular, or children with disabilities. It's often utilized frequently. And so I've been to school a very long time, but I am finished. I am all done. But I think Drexel really taught me that you can do anything temporarily. You could wake up at 5 a.m. and go to practice and be really sleep deprived, but you can also find joy, during the stress, and have a family there to support you. And I think those stressful times, as hard as they were, they had so much reward tied to them, and that allowed me to be able to see as I aged that even during hard times, I could still see that I was living a life that I really wanted, because I knew what my values were going to be as a professional.
Well, and you allude to, your certification for working with children and families with, with children with autism. You actually helped start a program at one of the places that you work. So can you kind of get into that story, how that came about, and why that was such a passion point for you, why you felt that was necessary to help out families of children with autism?
Sure. So when I came to DC, I had a really great mentor at the Children's Hospital in DC, Children's National, Penny Glass. She had actually started a developmental clinic at the hospital years and years ago. And she was late in her career at this point and has since retired. But I had the opportunity to be a student of hers, and I was doing developmental testing. And I would compare it similarly to like how much I was enjoying that developmental class at Drexel. I was just enthralled by development and finally working with a child. At that point in time, I hadn't really worked with a kid ever, so it was really interesting to me to finally meet them. And I loved what I was doing, but I was doing all evaluation and not treatment. And so I was wanting to get treatment experience working with children with autism and how best to support them and help them throughout their life. And so after I graduated, I had an opportunity at a hospital, a smaller hospital, but to be able to start a place where children could get assessed for autism and developmental delay, but then also get treated. But I had to start it. And I think it took a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, but we were successful in doing that. We built the program extensively at that time to being able to serve children from like 0 to 21, which is something that at that time it was very hard to find that type of resource in Washington, D.C. So it was a really, I think, powerful time of my career where I had just graduated, but was given this really valuable opportunity. And since this past year, actually, I've gone back to Children's National and have been just working within an early childhood clinic that we've actually started, and I'm helping develop their track for children with developmental delays and disabilities, and really focusing on that treatment side as well. I really enjoy the treatment side. The diagnosis is so important and critical, but after the diagnosis, these families really need a lot of assistance in raising a child that they weren't expecting to have in certain ways. And that has been, one of, I think, my most passionate areas of my life.
Well, and to kind of go along with that, obviously there's different needs for clinical psychologists in early development. What would you say the difference is for, just a family with a child who doesn't have those early development issues versus somebody with autism or something like that? What is the difference in terms of how patients and families are consulted with?
That's a really good, great question. I think sometimes it's still a question that I don't have all the answers to, but I would say one part is whenever a family has a baby, they come with tools that maybe their parents used with them, or they come with their own experiences and their own books that they've read to parent a typically developing child, for lack of better terms. And then if you have a child with autism or a medical condition or a developmental delay, suddenly a lot of those skills that you might have came with, those tools, don't quite work as well with this child. Or if you're talking to your friend about their baby, right, having a tantrum or not eating that well, it's harder for you to relate sometimes with a parent that's raising a child with like a medical condition that could really be interfering with feeding. And so I like to say raising a child with a special need takes a special toolbox. And as a psychologist, I get to teach those parents as well as help them cope with some of those adjustments that they go through, or that grief, even raising a child with different developmental needs, and give them this new toolbox that I like to share with families that could help them raise this extra special child in their life.
I think that's a really powerful metaphor. I think it's well said. And I got to ask you, obviously you've accomplished a lot early on in a very brief career so far. So as you look forward, what are some goals for you for maybe the future? I may be putting you on the spot there, but as you try to obviously grow in your profession, what are some things that are goals, or maybe things you're trying to accomplish in the next 5-10 years?
Let's see. I think for so many years, especially starting at way back thinking to Drexel, you're just like, go, go, go. And sometimes you are checking boxes off, right? And I'm trying really hard in my next 10 years, let's start there, these next 10 years, to live a life that aligns with these values instead of just like checking boxes off. And I think I really value connecting with other people, connecting with my patient families. I really work hard, I think, on trying to decrease the health disparities, especially in Washington, D.C., for families that are raising children with autism or developmental disorders that have a harder time accessing care, especially families of color. And I'm working really hard with a wonderful team at Children's to try to reduce those disparities, and figuring out ways that all families, regardless of social economics, can access care. And luckily, I think that is something I continue to be passionate about. And I would say in the next 10 years, I hope that we can continue to reduce those disparities and find better solutions for families that don't look like me, but still need a really special toolbox that I hope that I can give.
And let's say that maybe a student athlete or an undergrad is listening to this podcast and is intrigued by, your work, your career path, and wants to get into a similar field. What advice would you give to somebody like that for the process of becoming a clinical psychologist?
I would say if you want to become a clinical psychologist and you enjoy working with children and you have a lot of patience and you like to coach, you will probably enjoy a career in psychology, helping parents to develop a different type of toolbox for their child. I think if those qualities aren't there, you may not like this path as much. But I actually do what we call like parent coaching in some of the treatment sessions for a particular therapy that we use for children that have a lot of behavioral concerns. And when I think about coaching, I think about how many people have coached me throughout my life on hard days and days when I didn't want to always listen, but they didn't give up on me. And I try really hard to never give up on the families that I work with. And I think for students that may want to be able to give that type of gift to another family, this could be a great career.
Well, it's awesome to see you make that connection between sport and what you do for a career. So kind of transitioning back into sport real quick, I know that you're very involved still with the program, that you're, the alumni chair. We'll use that as the title for Drexel Softball, and you're very involved. So for you, why is it so important to have stayed so involved with the program over the last couple of years since you've graduated?
Oh man. I mean, well, so I got married this year in 2020. It was a much smaller
Congratulations.
wedding.
Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. So I did get married this year, and I think half of my wedding party was Drexel alumni. And so I had several of my former teammates that were bridesmaids and attended the wedding as well. Even though it was small and with masks, we still had a great time. and it was likely very safe. We were very blessed. And I think one of the reasons is I made connections and family throughout those 4 years that have lasted now, many, many years. So that's one reason, right? I really made these connections, which is such an important aspect of my life. And they all mean so much to me. And I'm about to be a bridesmaid in one of their weddings this upcoming year. So that'll be really fun. And then I think the other is, they took a gamble. Anytime a college coach invests in at that time, 17-year-old student athlete, it's a gamble. You don't really know, is this person going to show up to practice on time? Are they going to graduate? Are they going to perform well? They're handing over sometimes scholarship money and they don't know how you're going to do. And it was a gamble, I think, for any student at any time. You never know what's going to happen, but I think it's always a gamble, and it was a gamble for me to be given a scholarship, and they gave that to me because they believed that I would perform well, and I would always want to be able to give back, because the money that I saved from that scholarship, I was able to put to our grad school, which, helped that price. So I am very thankful that Drexel invested in me.
And if there's alumni listening to this podcast who are interested in contributing and want to do that, what advice would you give to them, or what would you tell them in terms of how they can contribute or get involved in helping the program after they've graduated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think depending on the team that you were on, I think it is all different in terms of how you can best assist. So I think for Drexel Softball, we've organize events along with the coaching staff, which has been incredibly supportive to us throughout the years. We've had alumni games where we all come back. Several of our teammates have children, of course. They bring their children, and you get to meet their families, and that helps you stay connected, as well as meeting the new team, right? And you can relate to them, even if it's years ago. You can still relate to their experience. And then lastly, of course, being able to financially support them, which is very hard when you first graduate, but then you hope over the years that you're able to give more. That's always a way to contribute to let the student athletes know that you're still thinking of them. And regardless if you graduated 1 year or 20 years or 50 years ago, you still have this common connection with a student athlete that graduated from Drexel.
And I know you already touched on this. You mentioned you had teammates in your wedding party, I should say. But just a little, to elaborate a little more, how meaningful have those connections been over the last 10, 12 years as you've been away from school? And, because we talk so much about how much those connections mean, but from your personal perspective, how helpful have your teammates been even after your time together at Drexel?
I mean, they've been monumental. Bree Brown played third base when I played at Drexel, and she was my maid of honor at my wedding, right? And she told Drexel stories, which could have gone a lot of different ways, but luckily we're very positive. But I think you have this connection from being a student athlete that's going to last throughout your life, right? You see someone really struggle and you're able to pick them up during a game, and you see a lot of losses and then you see a lot of wins, and it's a great representation of how the rest of your life is going to go. There's going to be a lot of hard times. There's going to be deaths. There's going to be breakups. There's going to be hardships and loss of jobs. There's a lot of downtime, and I think the beauty of being an athlete, I always like to say when I was there, was that we might not all be best friends on this team, but we all are a family, and we have to figure out how we're going to work together. And I think still to this day, these are obviously my best friends, but they've also become my family, and have been there for me during highs and lows of my life. And I hope I can always continue to be that for them, because we've always had that connection from years ago.
Well, and you guys, you had a team that was the first Drexel team to make the CAA playoffs. And now fast forward to present day, you got a Drexel roster, which, you've been supporting over the years, but it's been an exciting last couple of years for Coach Carl Taylor and the team. That, obviously 2020 due to the pandemic didn't get to have the season that we wanted, but what are your thoughts as an alumni, as a fan watching the team where it's at present day going into the 2021 campaign?
Yeah, I think it's extremely exciting time. I think it's exciting time for Drexel. I think it's exciting time for Drexel softball. I think, when I was there, we did not have the amount of, funding or the aesthetics that it currently has, which can bring in amazing recruits and give so many more opportunities to female athletes in particular. And I think they're on such a great path, and I hope that that continues. And I'm really eager to see how they continue to perform. I really enjoy when they play near DC because then we can go watch them. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to how these next few years go.
All right. Well, Amanda, that's really all the questions I had. 25 minutes flies by, and I know you're a little stretched for time, but I appreciate you taking the time that we had, and thanks so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks so much, Chris, for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.